Sumer, the lost civilization that invented everything we use today. To understand the world we live in today, you must first strip away everything you know. Turn off your smartphone. Forget the concept of a 60-minute hour. Erase the idea of the wheel, the sailboat, the map, and the written word. Forget the very notion of a city, of a school, of a law court. Imagine a world where humanity exists only in small, scattered bands, surviving at the mercy of the elements, hunting wild game and gathering wild grains. Now transport yourself back roughly 7,000 years to a flat, sun-baked plain in what is now southern Iraq. The Greeks would later call this land Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, but the people who eventually rose from the mud to build the first true civilization called it something else. They called it Ki-en-Gir, the land of the noble lords. We know them as the Sumerians. And their story is not just a chapter in a history book. It is the prologue to the human experience as we know it. Every time you check your watch and see that it is 12 o'clock, you are paying homage to the Sumerians. Every time you sign a contract, drink a beer, or read a sentence, you are using tools first forged in the fires of Sumer. They are the lost ancestors of modern thought, a people who emerged from the prehistoric mist to invent the blueprint of civilization itself, only to vanish into the sands, their language forgotten and their cities buried, until the spade of the modern archaeologist brought them back into the light. The environment of Sumer was not an Eden. It was a hostile, difficult place that demanded ingenuity for survival. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, which flooded with predictable regularity and enriched the soil with gentle grace, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were violent and unpredictable. They flooded in the spring, often destroying crops just as they were ready for harvest. The sun was scorching, with temperatures regularly soaring above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no stone for building, no timber for construction, and no metal for tools. There was only mud and reeds. It is a testament to the sheer resilience of the human spirit that it was here, in this resource-poor landscape, that humanity decided to build the impossible. The key was the silt. Over millennia, the rivers had deposited thick layers of fertile alluvial soil. If the water could be controlled, the soil could produce agricultural yields unseen anywhere else on Earth. And so, the first great invention of the Sumerians was not a physical object, but a social one: cooperation. To dig the canals, to build the levees, and to irrigate the fields required labor on a scale that a single family or tribe could not manage. It required organization. It required a plan. It required the seeds of the state. In the earliest days, known to archaeologists as the Ubaid period, stretching back to 5000 BC and beyond, the settlements were small. But at a site called Eridu, near the shores of the Persian Gulf, something changed. Later Sumerian mythology would cite Eridu as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven. Excavations at Eridu have revealed a sequence of temples, built one on top of the other, spanning thousands of years. The earliest was a tiny chapel of mud brick, barely large enough for a distinct altar. But as the centuries passed, the temple grew. It became a massive complex, raised on a platform dominating the flat landscape. This physical elevation of the temple mirrored the elevation of the deity it housed. The god of Eridu was Enki, the god of sweet waters, wisdom, and magic. The growth of the temple suggests that religion was the organizing principle of early Sumerian society. It was the temple priests who directed the irrigation work, who collected the surplus grain, and who distributed food in times of famine. The god owned the land. The people were merely his tenants. This theological framework provided the social cohesion necessary to scale up from a village to a city. By 4000 BC, we enter the Uruk period, named after the massive city that would become the metropolis of the ancient world. Uruk was a phenomenon. At its height, it housed perhaps 50 to 80,000 people within a territory of 6 square kilometers. To the prehistoric mind, this must have seemed like the entire population of the world gathered in one place. Living in such close quarters presented new challenges. Sanitation, dispute resolution, and food distribution became critical issues. It was in Uruk that the social stratification of society became petrified. There were the rulers, the priests, the artisans, and the farmers. And at the bottom, there were the slaves. The evidence of this complexity is found in the beveled rim bowl, a crude, mass-produced pottery vessel found in the millions across Mesopotamia. These bowls were likely used to dole out standard rations of grain or beer to workers. They represent the first evidence of a managed, industrial-scale labor force. The Uruk expansion was not just local. Artifacts in the Uruk style have been found as far away as Turkey and Iran, suggesting a colonial or trading network that spanned the Near East. But the complexity of Uruk created a problem that the human memory could not solve. How do you keep track of the taxes paid by 50,000 people? How do you know how much barley is in the granary, or how many sheep were sent to the temple herds? The solution to this problem was the single greatest intellectual leap in the history of our species, the invention of writing. It did not happen overnight. It began with tokens. For thousands of years, people in the Near East had used small clay tokens to represent goods. A cone might represent a measure of grain. A disc might represent a sheep. To ensure a transaction was secure, these tokens were sealed inside a hollow clay ball called a bulla. If a dispute arose, you could break the bulla and count the tokens. Eventually, some clever administrator realized that instead of hiding the tokens inside, they could press the tokens into the wet clay of the exterior to show what was inside. From there, the leap was small. Why do you need the tokens at all? Why not just make the mark? These marks evolved into pictographs, pictures of the items they represented. A picture of a foot meant to go or to walk. A picture of a head with a bowl meant to eat. Over centuries, these pictographs became stylized. The scribes, using a reed stylus with a triangular tip, found it easier to press wedge shapes into the clay rather than drawing curved lines. This script became known as cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus for wedge. But the true revolution happened when the script moved from pictographic to phonetic. This is the ribes principle. In English, it would be like drawing a picture of an eye and a picture of a can to write I can. The Sumerians realized that a symbol could represent a sound rather than just an object. This unlocked the ability to express abstract thought, grammar, and emotion. Suddenly, we are not just looking at lists of sheep. We are looking at hymns, prayers, letters, and myths. We can hear the voices of the Sumerians. We can read the lament of a father whose son is wayward in school. We can read the recipes for beer. We can read the Epic of Gilgamesh. The transition from prehistory to history is defined by this moment. Because of Sumerian scribes, the human experience became cumulative. Knowledge could be stored and passed down, independent of oral tradition. While the scribes were busy inventing writing, other Sumerian innovators were revolutionizing mechanics. The invention of the wheel is often cited as the hallmark of Sumerian genius, but the story is more nuanced. The wheel likely first appeared as a potter's wheel, a horizontal turntable used to shape clay vessels more quickly and uniformly. It took a few centuries for someone to flip the concept 90 degrees, attach it to an axle, and place it under a sledge. The impact was transformative. Suddenly, heavy loads could be transported over long distances. The ox-drawn cart became the semi-truck of the Bronze Age. But the wheel was not just for transport. It was applied to warfare. The Sumerians invented the war chariot. The earliest depictions, such as those on the standard of show four-wheeled wagons drawn by onagers, wild donkeys, carrying a driver and a warrior armed with javelins. These were not the sleek, fast chariots of the later Egyptians, but clumsy, heavy vehicles used to trample the enemy and transport shock troops. Nevertheless, they changed the nature of warfare, introducing mobility and speed to the battlefield. Alongside the wheel, the Sumerians developed a sophisticated system of mathematics. Unlike our base 10 system, which is based on the number of fingers on our hands, the Sumerians used a base 60 or sexagesimal system. Why 60? There are several theories. Some argue it was the result of combining two earlier counting systems, one base 12 and one BASE 5. Others point out that 60 is a highly composite number, meaning it can be easily divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it incredibly useful for trade and fractions. If you have 60 shekels of silver, you can easily divide them among 3, 4, or 5 workers without dealing with complex decimals. This system is the reason why we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. The Sumerians were the first to map the stars and divide the sky into manageable sections. Their astronomers tracked the movements of the planets with remarkable accuracy, recording their observations on tablets that would later inform the astronomy of the Babylonians and the Greeks. They understood the concept of the square root and the cube root. A tablet known as Plimpton 322 suggests they understood the principles of the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The intellectual achievements of Sumer were matched by their architectural ambition. The defining structure of the Sumerian city was the ziggurat. These were not tombs, like the Egyptian pyramids, but artificial mountains of sun-dried brick. The Sumerians believed that the gods lived in the high mountains to the east and north. Living on the flat plains, they felt distant from the divine. So they built their own mountains to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. The ziggurat consisted of stacked terraces, getting smaller as they rose, culminating in a temple at the very top. This upper temple was the waiting room of the god. The most famous ziggurat, the Great Ziggurat of built by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC, is a massive structure that still dominates the landscape today, though much of it has been reconstructed. The engineering required to build these structures was immense. The core was mud brick, but the exterior was faced with fired brick set in bitumen, a natural tar that bubbled up from the ground to protect it from the rain. Weepers, or drainage holes, were built into the walls to allow moisture to escape and prevent the mud brick core from swelling and bursting the structure. The religion that these ziggurats served was a complex and often pessimistic one. The Sumerian worldview was shaped by their environment. The floods were violent, the heat was oppressive, and the winds were dusty. Consequently, they viewed their gods as volatile and capricious masters who needed to be constantly appeased. Humans were created for one purpose only: to serve the gods, to work the land, and to provide the deities with food, drink, and clothing. The pantheon was vast. There was An, the distant sky god. There was Enlil, the god of the air and the storm, who granted kingship and could unleash devastation. There was Enkai, the clever god of fresh water and wisdom, often the friend of humanity. And there was Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the morning and evening star, whose ambition and temper were the subject of countless myths. Unlike the Egyptians, who looked forward to a blissful afterlife, the Sumerians believed that after death, everyone, king and peasant alike, went to a dark, dreary underworld where they ate dust and drank muddy water. This grim outlook focused their energy on the here and now, on achieving fame and leaving a name that would be remembered. This drive for remembrance brings us to the political landscape of Sumer. For much of its history, Sumer was not a unified country, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own patron god and its own ruler. These cities, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, were frequently at war with one another over water rights and borderlands. The ruler was initially a priest king known as an En, but as warfare became endemic, a secular military leader known as a Lugal, literally big man, emerged. The Lugal lived in a palace, separate from the temple, and commanded the army. One of the most vivid records of this intercity conflict is the Stele of the Vultures, dating to around 2450 BC. It commemorates the victory of Yanadam, king of Lagash, over the neighboring city of Umma. The stone carving depicts the king leading a phalanx of soldiers, armored men standing shoulder to shoulder, holding shields and spears, trampling over the bodies of their enemies. It is a chillingly familiar image of organized warfare. Behind the soldiers, vultures circle, carrying off the severed heads of the defeated. This was the reality of Sumerian politics, a constant struggle for dominance, resources, and the favor of the gods. Yet amidst the wars, society flourished. The Sumerian economy was robust and mixed. While the temples and palaces owned vast tracts of land, there was also private property and a thriving merchant class. Sumerian merchants traveled far and wide. We have evidence of trade with the Indus Valley Civilization in modern-day Pakistan, known to them as Meluha, with Oman, Magan, and with Bahrain, Dilmun. They exported grain, wool, and textiles, and imported the materials they lacked: copper, tin, gold, lapis lazuli, and timber. This trade necessitated a system of laws to regulate contracts and disputes. Long before Hammurabi, the Sumerians developed legal codes. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 BC, is the oldest surviving law code in the world. It lists crimes and their punishments. Interestingly, unlike the eye for an eye brutality of the later Babylonian law, the Sumerian code was often monetary. If a man knocked out another man's tooth, he paid a fine of silver. This suggests a sophisticated society that valued economic restitution over physical retribution. The position of women in Sumerian society was relatively high compared to later periods in Mesopotamian history. They could own property, engage in business, and testify in court. We have records of women running taverns, brewing beer, and managing estates. The first known author in all of human history was a woman, Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad and served as the high priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. She wrote passionate hymns to the goddess Inanna, signing her name to the works. In her writing, we see a distinct individual personality, a woman of power and intellect, asserting her voice across 4 millennia. She describes her exile, her suffering, and her eventual restoration. That we know her name and her thoughts is a victory over the silence of time. Daily life in Sumer was anchored by two staples, bread and beer. Beer was not just a recreational beverage. It was a source of nutrition and a way to make water safe to drink. The Sumerians had dozens of varieties of beer: sweet beer, dark beer, red beer. It was consumed through long straws from communal jars to filter out the sediment. The brewing of beer was under the protection of the goddess Ninkasi. A famous hymn to Ninkasi is actually a recipe for brewing. The diet was supplemented by onions, garlic, lentils, fish from the marshes, and dates from the ubiquitous palm trees. The date palm was the tree of life for the Sumerians. It provided food, fibers for rope, and wood for light construction. They lived in houses made of mud brick, usually built around a central courtyard that provided light and air while maintaining privacy. These houses were packed tightly together in a maze of narrow, winding streets. Archaeology at Ur has revealed that these houses had drainage systems and sometimes even lavatories. However, the political fragmentation of Sumer made it vulnerable. Around 2334 BC, a leader arose from the north who would change the map of the Middle East forever. His name was Sargon. He was not a Sumerian. He was an Akkadian. The Akkadians were a Semitic-speaking people who had lived alongside the Sumerians for centuries. Sargon rose from humble beginnings. Legend says he was found floating in a basket in the river, a motif that would later appear in the story of Moses to become the cupbearer to the king of Kish. He seized power and launched a campaign of conquest that unified the city-states of Sumer and Akkad under a single rule. Sargon created the world's first true empire. He standardized weights and measures, replaced local rulers with Akkadian governors, and made Akkadian the language of administration. Yet, he respected the Sumerian gods and culture. The Akkadian Empire was a bilingual civilization, where Sumerian was the language of learning and ritual, while Akkadian was the language of daily life. The Akkadian Empire lasted for about a century before collapsing under the weight of internal rebellions and invasions by the Gutians, a, quote, barbarian people from the Zagros Mountains. The Sumerian king list describes this period as a time of chaos. Who was king? Who was not king? But the Sumerian spirit was not dead. Around 2112 BC, the city of Ur rose to prominence again, inaugurating the Ur III period, often called the Sumerian Renaissance. This was the golden age of bureaucracy. The kings of Ur, starting with Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi, created a highly centralized state. They built the great ziggurat. They patronized the arts and literature. Shulgi, in particular, was a fascinating figure who bragged about his literacy, his musical ability, and his speed as a runner. He established schools, or edubas, where scribes were trained in the Sumerian classics. Much of the Sumerian literature we have today comes from copies made during this period. The bureaucracy was obsessive. We have tens of thousands of receipts for everything from dead sheep to bundles of reeds. It was a state run on paperwork, but even this golden age could not last. The Ur III state was threatened by the Amorites, nomadic tribes from the west, and the Elamites from the east. The end came violently. In 2004 BC, the Elamites sacked Ur. A moving poetic text, the Lament for Ur, describes the destruction, the bodies piling up in the gates, the hunger, the fire, the gods abandoning their shrines. With the fall of Ur, Sumer as a political entity ceased to exist. The Amorites moved in and established their own dynasties, the most famous being that of Babylon. The Sumerian people were assimilated. Their distinct genetic and ethnic identity dissolved into the melting pot of Mesopotamia. However, a strange thing happened. The Sumerian language did not die. For another 2,000 years, long after the last native speaker had turned to dust, Sumerian continued to be taught in the schools of Babylon and Assyria. It became the language of high culture, religion, and magic, much like Latin in medieval Europe. To be an educated scribe in the court of Nebuchadnezzar or Ashurbanipal, you had to read and write Sumerian. The myths were preserved. The gods were renamed. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea, but their stories remained rooted in the Sumerian tradition. The sexagesimal math system continued to be used. The observations of the stars were maintained. The legacy of Sumer was baked into the foundations of every civilization that followed in the Near East. The rediscovery of Sumer is one of the great detective stories of archaeology. Until the mid-19th century, Sumer was completely forgotten. The Bible mentioned Babylon and Nineveh, so early archaeologists went looking for those. When they dug into the mounds of southern Iraq, they found tablets in a language they couldn't read, a language that was neither Semitic, like Hebrew or Akkadian, nor Indo-European. It was an isolate, agglutinative language with no known relatives. Scholars initially doubted its existence, calling it a cryptographic code used by priests. It took decades of decipherment, led by scholars like Jules Oppert and Henry Rawlinson, to realize they were looking at a distinct, older civilization. The excavations of Leonard Woolley at Ur in the 1920s brought the grandeur of Sumer to the world. He discovered the royal tombs of Ur, dating to the early dynastic period. The treasures he found: the golden helmet of Meskelamdug, the intricate jewelry of Queen Puabi, the ram in a thicket, the bull-headed lyres, rivaled the treasures of Tutankhamun. But he also found evidence of human sacrifice. In the Great Death Pit, dozens of attendants, soldiers, and musicians were arranged in rows, having taken poison to accompany their master into the afterlife. It offered a grim, dazzling glimpse into the absolute power of the early Sumerian kings. One cannot discuss Sumer without delving deeper into their greatest literary contribution, the Epic of Gilgamesh. While the complete version we often read today is a later Babylonian compilation, the core stories are Sumerian. Gilgamesh was a real king of Uruk, appearing in the king list. The legends describe him as 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a ruler of boundless energy who oppressed his people until the gods created a wild man, Enkidu, to check him. The two wrestle, become best friends, and embark on adventures. They kill the monster Humbaba in the cedar forest. They slay the bull of heaven. But then Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is shattered. The king who conquered the world is paralyzed by the fear of his own mortality. He abandons his throne and wanders the wild, seeking Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, to learn the secret of eternal life. The flood story in Gilgamesh predates the biblical account of Noah by centuries, yet the parallels are undeniable. The angry gods, the boat, the birds, released to find land. In the end, Gilgamesh fails to achieve immortality. He returns to Uruk, empty-handed. But as he approaches the city, he looks at the massive walls he built. He realizes that immortality is not living forever in the flesh, but in the legacy one leaves behind: the bricks laid, the city built, the name remembered. It is a profoundly human conclusion, resonating just as strongly today as it did 4,000 years ago. The Sumerian medical texts also reveal a pragmatic approach to healing. While they believed that demons and angry gods caused sickness, they also used observation and pharmacology. They classified diseases. They prescribed poultices, washes, and potions made from plants, minerals, and animal products. We have recipes that include salt, saltpeter, milk, snakeskin, and turtle shell, but also thyme, cassia, and myrrh. There were two types of healers: the Ashipu, who relied on magic and incantations to drive out the demon, and the Asu, the physician who treated the symptoms with physical medicine. Often, they worked together. This duality of magic and science is characteristic of the Sumerian mind. They were keen observers of the natural world, yet they saw the hand of the divine in every wind and wave. The influence of Sumer extends into the realm of the esoteric. The practice of hepatoscopy, divining the future by inspecting the liver of a sacrificed sheep, was a high science in Sumer. They believed that at the moment of sacrifice, the god wrote the future on the organ. Clay models of livers divided into grid sections with detailed instructions on how to interpret marks and anomalies have been found. This practice spread to the Hittites, the Etruscans, and eventually the Romans. The desire to know the unknown, to predict the unpredictable, drove them to map the heavens. They identified the path of the sun, the ecliptic, and the constellations of the zodiac. The bull of heaven is Taurus. The lion is Leo. When you read a horoscope today, you are engaging with a tradition that began in the ziggurats of Ur and Uruk. It is difficult to overstate the importance of the Sumerian invention of the school. The Aduba, tablet house, was the institution where culture was transmitted. It was a rigorous, often harsh environment. Students, mostly boys from wealthy families, would attend from sunrise to sunset. They started by learning how to make a tablet and hold a stylus. Then they practiced writing simple wedges. Then they memorized lists of wood, lists of animals, lists of professions, lists of towns. This lexical lists tradition is how we know so much about their vocabulary. After the lists came mathematics, then proverbs, and finally the great works of literature. Discipline was strict. A man in charge of the whip was a standard staff member. In one famous text, a student recounts his day. I went to school. I recited my tablet. I ate my lunch. I prepared my new tablet. I finished it. Then they assigned me my oral work. The teacher said, "Your hand is not good," and he beat me. The goal was to create a scribe, a dusar, a member of the bureaucratic elite who could run the state. The legacy of Sumer is also found in our architecture. The arch, the dome, and the vault were all used by Sumerian builders. Because they lacked wood and stone, they had to master the use of mud brick. To span a roof without long wooden beams, they developed the arch. To decorate their mud walls, they invented the cone mosaic, thousands of clay cones dipped in red, black, and white colors, pressed into the wet plaster to create geometric patterns that also protected the wall from weathering. The sheer scale of their construction projects proves their mastery of logistics. The wall of Uruk was said to be nearly 10 kilometers long. The labor required to make millions of bricks, transport them, and lay them is staggering. The demise of the Sumerians as a distinct people is a lesson in environmental collapse. The very irrigation that allowed them to thrive eventually killed them. The water of the Tigris and Euphrates carries dissolved salts. When the water sits on the fields and evaporates in the hot sun, it leaves the salt behind. Over centuries, the salt accumulated in the soil. Wheat is intolerant of salt, so the Sumerians switched to barley, which is more resistant. We can track this in the records. In the early period, wheat and barley were grown in equal measure. By the end of the Sumerian period, wheat had almost disappeared. Eventually, the ground became so saline that even barley would not grow. The agricultural yields crashed. The economic foundation of the civilization crumbled. The center of power shifted north to Babylon, where the soil was not yet ruined. The Sumerians had engineered their own destruction through the very technology that gave them life. As we look back at Sumer, we see a reflection of ourselves. We see a people obsessed with technology, with record-keeping, with law, and with control. We see a people struggling with their environment, building walls against the unknown, and asking the big questions about life and death. They were the first to wrestle with the burden of civilization. They were the first to live in cities, the first to write down their thoughts, the first to codify their laws. They made the mistakes so we could learn from them, though often we repeat them. They were the pioneers of the human experiment. When the sun set over the ziggurat of Ur 4,000 years ago, casting long shadows over the brickwork, the priests might have chanted a hymn to Nana, hoping for protection in the night. They could not have known that their empire would fall, their language would die, and their cities would melt back into the mud. But they also could not have known that 5,000 years later, in a world of glass and steel, people would still be using their wheel, their time, their math, and their writing. The Sumerians are not truly lost. They are woven into the very fabric of our daily lives, invisible but omnipresent, the silent architects of the modern world. The rediscovery of the royal game of Ur offers a lighter yet poignant glimpse into their lives. Found by Woolley in the royal tombs, this board game, played with dice and counters, was a favorite pastime. Rules found on a later Babylonian tablet allow us to play it today. It's a race game, similar to backgammon. Imagine two Sumerians, perhaps off-duty soldiers or merchants, sitting in the shade of a date palm, throwing the pyramidal dice, laughing at a bad roll, betting on the outcome. It humanizes them. They were not just statues with wide, staring eyes. They were people who got bored, who sought entertainment, who competed. This connection across the millennia is what makes history so powerful. It reminds us that, while technology changes, human nature remains remarkably constant. The Sumerian influence on the Bible is another area of immense scholarly interest. The story of the Garden of Eden has parallels in the Sumerian myth of Dilmun, a paradise land where there is no sickness or death. The Tower of Babel is almost certainly a reference to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, likely the Etemenanki in Babylon, which was built in the Sumerian tradition. The confusion of tongues in the biblical story may echo the moment when the uniformity of the Sumerian world was shattered by the arrival of new peoples and languages. Even the form of the laws in Exodus, "If a man does X, then Y shall happen," mirrors the casuistic format of the code of Ur-Nammu. These echoes suggest that the cultural memory of Sumer persisted in the oral traditions of the Near East long after the cities themselves were abandoned. Let us consider the concept of the me. In Sumerian mythology, the me were the divine decrees or templates of civilization. They were physical objects or concepts that Enki, the god of wisdom, controlled. They included things like kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, and ascent from the underworld, but also very specific crafts like basket weaving, metalworking, and even negative attributes like strife and prostitution. The myth of Inanna and Enki tells how Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, got the me from Enki by getting him drunk and loading them onto her boat of heaven to take back to her city. This story is a metaphorical explanation for the transfer of cultural supremacy from Eridu, Enki's city, to Uruk, Inanna's city. It shows that the Sumerians viewed civilization not as a human invention, but as a divine treasure that could be moved, stolen, or lost. It was a set of tools given by the gods, and it was humanity's duty to maintain them. The artistic legacy of Sumer is equally profound. The cylinder seal was a uniquely Mesopotamian invention. These were small cylinders of stone, often semi-precious like lapis lazuli or carnelian, carved with intricate scenes. When rolled over wet clay, they created a continuous panoramic image. These were used as signatures and marks of ownership. The carving required incredible precision, as it was done in negative and in miniature. The scenes depict mythological events, banquets, animals, and geometric patterns. They are some of the finest examples of glyptic art in the ancient world. They tell us about the fashion of the time, the fringed skirts of the men, the elaborate hairstyles of the women. They show us the instruments they played, the furniture they used, and the gods they worshipped. Another fascinating aspect is the Sumerian problem. For a long time, scholars debated where the Sumerians came from. Their language is unrelated to the Semitic languages of their neighbors, Akkadians, Babylonians, or the Indo-European languages of the peoples to the north. This led to the theory that they were migrants who arrived in Mesopotamia from somewhere else, perhaps the mountains of Iran, or by sea from India. However, modern archaeology tends to view them as a local development. The continuity of pottery and settlement patterns from the Ubaid period suggests that the Sumerians emerged from the indigenous population of the marshlands, perhaps mixing with peoples moving down from the foothills as the climate changed. They were the product of the unique ecological niche of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta. The military innovation of the composite bow also has roots in this region. While the simple bow was known for millennia, the composite bow made of wood, horn, and sinew, laminated together, was a technological leap. It had much greater power and range than a self-bow of the same size. This weapon, combined with the chariot, would eventually revolutionize warfare in the Bronze Age, though its full dominance would come with later empires. The Sumerians, however, laid the groundwork for the organized standing army. The stele of the vultures shows not just a mob, but a disciplined formation. This implies drill, command structures, and logistics, the ability to feed and equip an army in the field. The end of the Sumerian civilization was not an extinction of the people, but a cultural absorption. As the Amorites took power and established Babylon, they adopted the trappings of Sumerian kingship. Hammurabi, the great Babylonian lawgiver, called himself the king of Sumer and Akkad. He looked back to the Sumerian past for legitimacy. The gods were synchronized. The temples were maintained. But the spoken language died out, surviving only in the chant of the priest and the scratch of the scholar's stylus. It is a haunting reminder that cultures are fragile. They require maintenance. They require a viable environment. And even the most advanced civilization can fall if the foundations, ecological and social, crumble. Finally, we must recognize the sheer audacity of the Sumerian experiment. They had no precedents. They had no guidebooks. When they built the first city, they were making it up as they went along. When they wrote the first sentence, they were venturing into the cognitive unknown. They were the first to impose order on chaos on such a massive scale. They were the first to say, "We will not just survive, we will build." Their legacy is not just in the inventions we use, but in the very way we think about ourselves as a collective. We are all, in a sense, citizens of Sumer. We live in the house they designed. We walk down the streets they paved. We write the words they encoded. And in the silence of the Mesopotamian desert, if you listen closely to the wind blowing over the melted mounds of mud brick, you might just hear the faint echo of a scribe counting barley, a priest chanting to Enlil, or a mother singing a lullaby, spanning the abyss of time to tell us, we were here, we were real, and we are you. Yet to truly honor this echo across the millennia, we must look closer than the broad strokes of history allow, zooming in from the wide-angle view of empires and eras to the specific, gritty details of how this civilization actually functioned. We need to understand not just that they wrote, but how the rigorous discipline of writing restructured the human mind. Not just that they died, but how they faced the grave with a mixture of terrifying ritual and artistic beauty. And not just that they irrigated the land, but how that very mastery sowed the salts of their eventual destruction. To understand the true heart of Sumer, we must leave the general timeline and enter the specific spaces where their culture was forged. The strict confines of the schoolroom, the silence of the royal tomb, and the banks of the life-giving canals. The journey into this deeper understanding begins with the most fundamental of their innovations, the precise skill that made all other complexity possible. The scribal art of Sumer was not merely a convenient method of record-keeping. It was the engine that drove the civilization, the very act that transformed a collection of villages into a complex, self-aware society. To truly grasp the world of the Sumerians, one must first enter the clay-scented halls of the Aduba, the tablet house, where the future administrators, priests, and poets of Mesopotamia were painstakingly molded. The journey of cuneiform, from its humble beginnings as crude pictographs to a sophisticated system capable of expressing the most profound human emotions, is perhaps the greatest intellectual adventure in our shared history. The raw material for this revolution was abundantly available, the very mud beneath their feet. Sumerian scribes worked with fine plastic clay, which was carefully prepared, kneaded, and shaped into various forms depending on its intended use. Administrative tablets, for instance, were often small, cushion-shaped, or rectangular, designed for efficiency in handling and storage. Literary texts, royal inscriptions, and more complex legal documents might be written on larger, multi-columned tablets, or even on cylinders or prisms, which allowed for longer narratives or decrees to be inscribed and permanently preserved. The stylus, the scribe's primary tool, was fashioned from a reed cut at an angle to create a triangular or wedge-shaped tip. This simple instrument dictated the very nature of cuneiform script. Instead of drawing curved lines which were difficult and messy to incise into wet clay, the scribes learned to press the angled tip into the clay, creating the characteristic wedge-shaped marks that define cuneiform. This transition was not merely stylistic. It was a fundamental shift that made writing faster, more efficient, and ultimately more adaptable. The evolution of cuneiform was a gradual process spanning centuries. It began with pictograms, simple drawings representing objects, a head for man, a bowl for food, a star for God or sky. These were often combined to express more complex ideas, becoming ideograms. A head with a bowl might mean to eat or mouth. However, this system was limited. It could convey concrete nouns and verbs, but struggled with abstract concepts, grammatical elements, and proper names. The true breakthrough came with the adoption of the rebus principle, where a sign no longer represented the object it depicted, but the sound of that object. For example, the Sumerian word for arrow sounded similar to the word for life. So the pictogram for arrow could be used to write the sound for life. This phonetic innovation allowed scribes to represent syllables. What started as a few hundred pictograms gradually transformed into a complex syllabary where signs could represent consonant-vowel CV, vowel-consonant VC, or consonant-vowel-consonant CVC combinations. By the time cuneiform reached its mature form, it comprised several hundred signs, each potentially having multiple phonetic values, polyphony, and some sounds being represented by multiple signs, homophony. This complexity made cuneiform a challenging script to master, but it also granted it immense expressive power. The mastery of this script was the primary goal of the Eduba, the Sumerian school system. These tablet houses were not open to all. Entry was typically reserved for boys from elite families, sons of scribes, priests, wealthy merchants, and palace officials. It was a rigorous, often brutal environment designed to produce the highly skilled bureaucrats essential for the functioning of the Sumerian state. A student's day began early and ended late. The curriculum was structured and comprehensive. Initial lessons focused on the mechanics of writing, how to prepare a tablet, how to hold the stylus, and how to press the wedges correctly. Students would then move on to memorizing lists. Lexical lists were fundamental. There were lists of plants, animals, birds, fish, stones, geographical names, professions, and more. These lists were not just vocabulary exercises. They were the encyclopedias of the ancient world, categorizing knowledge and providing a standardized reference for the vast Sumerian lexicon. Mastering these lists meant mastering the complex system of cuneiform signs, their various phonetic values, and their ideographic meanings. After the foundational lists, students progressed to more advanced subjects. Mathematics was crucial for administration, land surveying, and temple accounts. They learned the sexagesimal system, performing calculations involving fractions, areas, and volumes. Discipline was paramount. Teachers, known as fathers of the school, oversaw the instruction, while big brothers, senior students, assisted with lessons and maintained order. The man in charge of the whip was a regular fixture, ready to administer corporal punishment for poor handwriting, talking out of turn, or late arrival. Surviving school life texts provide vivid, sometimes humorous accounts of this rigorous environment. One such text describes a student recounting a day of numerous beatings for various transgressions, culminating in his father inviting the headmaster for dinner to appease him, hinting at the high social stakes involved in a son's education. The ultimate goal was to become a, quote, dubsar, a scribe, a prestigious and powerful position in Sumerian society. Scribes were the bedrock of Sumerian administration. They managed temple estates, recorded legal proceedings, drafted contracts, conducted censuses, and handled all correspondence. They were the keepers of knowledge, the memory of the state. There were different specializations. Temple scribes managed the vast properties and offerings to the gods. Royal scribes served the king, and legal scribes documented court cases and property transfers. While the vast majority of scribes were men, there is evidence, albeit limited, of female scribes. The most famous example is Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who served as the high priestess of Ur. Her hymns to Inanna are not only masterpieces of Sumerian literature, but also the first known literary works attributed to a specific author in history. Her ability to sign her name to her compositions and express complex theological and personal experiences underscores the intellectual sophistication achieved by some women in this society. The literary output of Sumerian scribes is staggering, covering a wide array of genres. There were hymns praising gods and kings, laments mourning destroyed cities, myths explaining the creation of the world and the deeds of the gods, wisdom literature offering moral advice, and proverbs reflecting common sense and societal values. The Epic of Gilgamesh, while best known in its later Babylonian recension, has its roots firmly in Sumerian lore. Sumerian versions of individual Gilgamesh episodes, such as Gilgamesh and Huwawa, the monster of the cedar forest, or Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven reveal the foundational narratives that would later be woven into a cohesive epic. These tales explored universal themes: friendship, love, loss, the quest for immortality, and the acceptance of human mortality. The Lament for Ur, a poignant poem describing the city's destruction by the Elamites, is a masterpiece of elegiac poetry expressing deep sorrow and disillusionment. Other texts include debate poems, where opposing entities like bird and fish or hoe and plow argue their respective merits, showcasing a playful intellectual tradition. The preservation and eventual decipherment of cuneiform represent one of the great triumphs of modern scholarship. For millennia, after the last native speaker of Sumerian had vanished, the language lived on in the Adubas of succeeding Mesopotamian empires. Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian scribes meticulously copied Sumerian texts, learning it as a classical language, much like Latin in medieval Europe. This practice ensured that countless Sumerian literary and administrative texts survived, buried in the ruins of ancient cities. The decipherment process in the 19th century was a monumental intellectual effort, starting with the trilingual inscriptions of Darius I at Behistun, deciphered by Henry Rawlinson, which contained Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. Once Akkadian was cracked, scholars like Jules Oppert and Edward Hinks could then turn their attention to the older, more complex Sumerian texts, realizing they were dealing with a completely different language from a previously unknown civilization. The sheer volume of tablets recovered, hundreds of thousands, continues to provide new insights into the Sumerian world, a testament to the enduring power of the written word. Moving from the intellectual realm to the visceral realities of Sumerian belief, perhaps no archaeological discovery offers a more chilling yet illuminating glimpse into their worldview than the royal tombs of Ur. Unearthed by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, these tombs, dating to the early dynastic period, circa 2600–2500 BC, revealed not merely the opulent burials of kings and queens, but irrefutable evidence of mass human sacrifice, a practice that sends shivers down the spine even today. Woolley's excavations at Tel al-Mukhayr, the site of ancient Ur, initially aimed at exploring the ziggurat. But beneath the massive artificial mountain, he stumbled upon a cemetery, unlike any other. The Royal Cemetery, as he named it, contained over 2,000 burials, but a cluster of 16 exceptionally rich tombs stood out, distinguished by their monumental architecture and astonishing wealth. The architecture of these royal tombs was impressive. Deep shafts, sometimes over 10 meters deep, led to subterranean chambers constructed of mud brick and stone, roofed with corbelled arches or vaults, early examples of these advanced building techniques. The most famous of these, PG 800, the tomb of Queen Puabi, or Puabum, was a small intact burial chamber within a larger pit. Puabi herself was found adorned with a magnificent gold and lapis lazuli headdress, elaborate necklaces, and rings. Nearby lay 2 attendants, a chariot drawn by oxen, and the skeletons of 9 women musicians and attendants, all dressed in ceremonial attire, seemingly having gone willingly to their deaths. Even more dramatic was the Great Death Pit, designated PG 1237. Here, Woolley found 74 bodies, mostly women, but also some soldiers, attendants, and musicians, arranged in neat rows. They were not thrown haphazardly into the pit. They were carefully laid out, many still wearing their ornate jewelry and holding their instruments. A group of 10 female musicians played their lyres and harps, their fingers still resting on the strings. In front of them, rows of soldiers with copper helmets and spears stood guard. The most chilling detail was the presence of small clay cups near the heads of many of the deceased, suggesting they had drunk poison, perhaps a potent opiate, before lying down to die. This was not a chaotic massacre, but a meticulously orchestrated ritual. The most widely accepted interpretation is that these individuals were members of the royal court, accompanying their deceased monarch into the afterlife, believing their service would continue beyond the grave. The grave goods found in these tombs are unparalleled in their artistry and luxury. The golden helmet of Mescalamdug, hammered from a single sheet of electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, to resemble an elaborate wig, is a masterpiece of ancient metallurgy. Puabi's headdress, consisting of gold leaves, lapis lazuli beads, and carnelian flowers, demonstrates exquisite craftsmanship and a sophisticated understanding of adornment. The ram in a thicket, a pair of statuettes depicting goats rearing up against stylized trees, made of gold, lapis lazuli, and shell, showcases a remarkable blend of precious materials and artistic skill. Bull-headed lyres, their wooden frames exquisitely decorated with gold, lapis lazuli, and shell inlay, are among the earliest and most beautiful musical instruments ever found. The presence of materials like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, and gold from Egypt or Anatolia testifies to Ur's extensive trade networks and its position at the heart of an interconnected Bronze Age world. These discoveries force us to confront the Sumerian conception of death and the afterlife. Unlike the Egyptians, whose elaborate mortuary cults were geared towards ensuring a blissful journey to an eternal paradise, the Sumerian afterlife, known as the, quote, land of no return, was a bleak, dusty realm. All souls, regardless of their earthly status, were destined for this shadowy underworld, where they ate dust and drank muddy water. Given this pessimistic outlook, the immense wealth and human sacrifice in the royal tombs present a paradox. Why such extravagance if the afterlife was so grim? Scholars propose several theories. One is that the death pits represent a very early, perhaps transient phase of Sumerian belief, where the immediate retinue of a powerful ruler was believed to extend his influence and authority into the underworld for a limited time. Another theory, the death banquet hypothesis, suggests these were communal feasts held in honor of the dead, with the participants sacrificing themselves at the climax. More likely, these rituals underscore the absolute, quasi-divine authority of the early Sumerian kings. Their status was such that their earthly court was expected to continue serving them, even in death, a testament to the immense power wielded by these Lugals. The sheer act of a glorious burial filled with treasures may have also been a way for the living to ensure the king's name and legacy endured, thereby granting a form of immortality through remembrance, if not through physical existence. The blurring lines between divine authority and human kingship are critical here. Early Sumerian rulers, particularly in the Uruk and early dynastic periods, were often seen as intermediaries, chosen by the gods, or even possessing divine characteristics themselves. A magnificent burial, accompanied by the entire court, was a ritual affirmation of this divine mandate, meant to secure the king's continued favor with the gods and ensure the prosperity of his city. The horror of the human sacrifice from a modern perspective would have been to the Sumerians a necessary and perhaps even honorable act of devotion, maintaining the cosmic order and the bond between the divine and the human realm. The royal tombs thus provide a unique, unsettling, and undeniably powerful window into the early Sumerian mind, revealing a society that valued order, hierarchy, and the enduring power of its rulers above all else. However, the grandeur of Sumerian cities and the wealth of their elite were ultimately built upon the most fundamental and precarious of foundations, their hydraulic engineering. It was the mastery of water, the very lifeblood of their civilization, that allowed Sumer to flourish in an otherwise hostile environment. But it was also the unintended consequences of this mastery that contributed to its eventual decline. The Mesopotamian plain, particularly in the south, is an almost impossibly flat, arid landscape, baked by intense sun for much of the year. The Tigris and Euphrates, while providing the necessary water, were notoriously unpredictable, prone to violent spring floods when snow melted in the northern mountains, often devastating ripe crops. In contrast to the gentle, predictable inundation of the Nile, the Mesopotamian rivers required constant, intensive management. The Sumerians' first great feat of engineering was not a ziggurat or a city wall, but a vast and intricate network of irrigation canals. These canals were the arteries of their civilization, diverting water from the main rivers and distributing it across the fields. The construction and maintenance of such a system required immense organization and communal labor. Early villages coalesced into larger settlements precisely because this collective effort was essential for survival. Corvée labor, a system where citizens were compelled to contribute their labor to public works for a certain period each year, was undoubtedly a foundational element of early Sumerian statehood, directed by temple priests and later by the Lugals. The canal network was hierarchical. Large main canals drew water directly from the rivers, feeding into smaller distributary canals, which in turn fed into even smaller field channels, bringing water directly to individual plots. The gradient of the land was minimal, requiring precise engineering to ensure water flowed effectively. We know they used surveying techniques to establish levels and slopes, though the exact tools for this are not fully understood. The agricultural techniques employed by the Sumerians were highly sophisticated for their time. Their most iconic tool was likely the seed plow, depicted on cylinder seals and later described in agricultural texts. This plow allowed seeds to be dropped directly into the furrow as it was being tilled, ensuring efficient planting and maximizing yields. The primary crops were barley and, to a lesser extent, wheat. Barley, being more salt-tolerant, eventually became the dominant grain. They also cultivated dates, onions, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, and various vegetables. Fish from the abundant marshes and domestic animals, sheep, goats, cattle, supplemented their diet. The date palm was particularly vital, providing not only food but also timber, fibers, and fuel. Crop rotation, though not fully understood in its modern scientific sense, was practiced, with fields sometimes left fallow, unplanted, for a season or longer to allow the soil to recover. The agricultural yields of Sumer were legendary, often cited as contributing to the density of their population and the surplus necessary to support non-food producing specialists like artisans, priests, and scribes. However, this very success harbored the seeds of future destruction. The inherent flaw in the Sumerian irrigation system, and indeed in all ancient irrigation in arid environments, was the process of salinization. The waters of the Tigris and Euphrates, like all river waters, contained dissolved mineral salts. When this water was diverted onto the fields, the intense Mesopotamian sun caused rapid evaporation. The water would disappear, but the salts would remain, accumulating in the topsoil. Over time, these salts built up to toxic levels, inhibiting plant growth. Capillary action also played a role. As water evaporated from the surface, it drew more saline groundwater upwards, further concentrating the salts in the root zone of the crops. The evidence for this environmental catastrophe is compelling and comes directly from Sumerian cuneiform records. Agricultural administrative texts meticulously documented crop yields over centuries. Scholars have analyzed these records and observed a clear and dramatic decline in productivity in southern Mesopotamia. In the early periods, around 3500–2500 BC, wheat and barley were grown in roughly equal proportions. But by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the proportion of wheat grown sharply declined, and barley, being more tolerant of saline conditions, became increasingly dominant. By the late Sumerian period, around 2100–2000 BC, wheat cultivation had almost ceased in the south, and even barley yields were significantly reduced, sometimes by as much as 2/3 compared to earlier periods. This decline in agricultural output had profound economic and social consequences. Reduced food production meant less surplus, less wealth, and a diminished capacity to support large urban populations and ambitious state projects. The decline of agricultural productivity directly contributed to the shift in political power. As the southern Sumerian heartland became increasingly saline and infertile, the center of gravity of Mesopotamian civilization gradually moved northward. Cities like Ur, Yeruk, and Lagash, once mighty metropolises, saw their populations shrink and their economic power wane. New powers arose further north, in cities like Akkad and later Babylon and Assyria, where the salinization problem was less severe due to slightly different hydrology and rainfall patterns. The very ecological niche that had allowed the Sumerians to flourish became their undoing, a poignant reminder of the delicate balance between human ingenuity and environmental limits. The Sumerians were not entirely unaware of the problem. Some texts suggest they understood the concept of fallowing fields to allow salts to leach out, or even attempting to flush fields with fresh water. However, these methods were often insufficient to counteract the relentless buildup of salts in a long-term, intensive irrigation system in an arid environment. The scale of the problem eventually overwhelmed their adaptive strategies. The constant intercity warfare over dwindling resources, particularly fertile land and water rights, exacerbated the crisis. The famous conflict between Lagash and Umma, recorded on the stelae of the vultures, was largely a dispute over a fertile border region and access to irrigation canals. This struggle over dwindling arable land would have only intensified as salinization took its toll. The legacy of Sumerian hydraulic engineering is therefore a complex one, a double-edged sword that brought both unprecedented prosperity and eventual ecological degradation. It stands as a powerful cautionary tale, illustrating how even the most brilliant technological innovations can have unforeseen and devastating long-term consequences. The Sumerians' ability to transform a desolate floodplain into a breadbasket was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to human ingenuity and collective effort. Yet their triumph over nature also contained the seeds of their own destruction, a process that unfolded slowly over millennia, leaving a saline scar on the land that can still be observed in parts of southern Iraq today. The mud brick cities, which literally rose from the earth, eventually melted back into it, victims of the very water that had given them life. The sophisticated administrative apparatus developed to manage these vast agricultural estates and canal systems played a crucial role in shaping the Sumerian state. The temple, as the central economic institution, employed armies of scribes, overseers, and laborers. Thousands of clay tablets detail the allocation of land, the distribution of rations, the accounting of crops, and the management of livestock. This bureaucratic precision was directly linked to their ability to maximize agricultural output and manage the complex logistics of a city-state. Without these records, it would have been impossible to coordinate the labor required for canal maintenance or to distribute food to a large urban population. The emphasis on record keeping, born out of economic necessity, further propelled the development and refinement of cuneiform writing, creating a feedback loop between agricultural innovation and administrative complexity. Beyond the practicalities of irrigation and record keeping, Sumerian society was also characterized by a deep engagement with the celestial sphere, linking their earthly concerns with the movements of the heavens. While their astronomical observations were primarily driven by calendrical needs for agriculture and religious rituals, they laid the foundation for systematic astronomy that would be further developed by the Babylonians. The Sumerians divided the year into 12 months based on lunar cycles and added intercalary months, a 13th month, periodically to keep the lunar calendar in sync with the solar year and the agricultural seasons. This practical application of astronomy ensured that planting and harvesting occurred at the optimal times, crucial for maximizing yields in their irrigation-dependent economy. They meticulously observed the rising and setting of prominent stars and constellations. While not yet formalizing the zodiac in the way the Babylonians later would, they identified key constellations. The Bull of Heaven, for instance, mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, corresponds to the constellation Taurus. Their sexagesimal number system, with its division of the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, permeated their astronomical calculations, allowing for precise measurements of angles and time intervals. This system, incredibly durable, has endured to this day, a direct inheritance from the Sumerian skies. The practice of omen-taking, particularly through extispicy, examining animal entrails, was also intricately linked to their understanding of divine will, reinforcing the idea that the gods communicated through signs in the natural world, including the heavens. The enduring influence of Sumerian thought on subsequent civilizations is perhaps most evident in the realm of law. While Hammurabi's Code, circa 1754 BC, is widely recognized as the most famous ancient legal document, it was built upon a Sumerian foundation. The earliest known law code belongs to Ur-Nammu, king of Ur, circa 2100 BC. Discovered in fragmentary form, the Code of Ur-Nammu predates Hammurabi by 3 centuries and offers a fascinating contrast. Unlike Hammurabi's principle of an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's code often prescribed monetary fines for physical offenses. For example, if a man broke another man's bone, he paid a specific amount of silver. This suggests a legal system that prioritized restitution and compensation, reflecting a more economically sophisticated and perhaps less punitive approach to justice than later Mesopotamian legal traditions. These legal codes were not merely abstract principles, they were practical tools for regulating society, ensuring fair trade, protecting property rights, and resolving disputes. Sumerian contracts, meticulously inscribed on clay tablets, cover everything from land sales and slave purchases to marriage agreements and loans. The precision of these documents, often sealed with cylinder seals bearing the unique impression of the parties involved, speaks to a society that valued legal certainty and orderly transactions. The concept of legal precedent, where past rulings influenced future judgments, also emerges from their extensive legal records. This systematic approach to law provided the framework for a complex urban society, allowing millions of transactions and interactions to occur with a degree of trust and predictability. The artistic achievements of Sumer, beyond the stunning grave goods of Ur, also demonstrate their innovative spirit. Lacking stone for monumental sculpture, they became masters of terracotta and bronze. Their statues, particularly the large-eyed votive figures found in temples, depict worshippers in perpetual prayer, their hands clasped, their gaze fixed on the deity. These figures, with their stylized features and idealized forms, were meant to represent the worshipper before the god, ensuring continuous supplication. The use of elaborate headdresses and intricate detailing in the figures' attire provides further insight into Sumerian fashion and social status. The cylinder seal, mentioned previously, deserves further exploration due to its pervasive use and artistic merit. These small, rolling stamps were ubiquitous in Sumerian society, serving as signatures, marks of ownership, and even amulets. The scenes carved onto their surfaces are miniature masterpieces, depicting myths, rituals, heroic contests with animals, banquets, and everyday life. The sheer variety and artistic quality of these seals are astonishing. They often reflect the popular myths and religious beliefs of the time, such as the hero Gilgamesh wrestling lions or gods receiving offerings. The continuous narrative that unfolds as the seal is rolled across clay reveals a sophisticated compositional sense. The precision required to carve these intricate scenes in reverse on a small, often hard stone cylinder speaks to the extraordinary skill of Sumerian lapidaries. The Sumerians were also pioneers in metallurgy. While the earliest copper artifacts in Mesopotamia predate the Sumerians, it was in Sumer that large-scale metal production, particularly of copper and later bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, truly took off. Lacking native copper and tin, they established extensive trade networks to import these crucial metals. They developed sophisticated techniques for smelting, casting, and working metals. Copper tools, weapons, and decorative objects became commonplace, gradually replacing earlier stone and bone implements. The transition to bronze, a harder and more durable alloy, marked a significant technological leap, giving them an advantage in warfare and agriculture. The royal tombs of Ur, with their abundance of gold, silver, copper, and electrum artifacts, stand as a testament to their metallurgical prowess and their ability to procure precious materials from distant lands. The very concept of a multi-ethnic, multilingual society also has roots in Sumer. From its earliest periods, Sumer was home to both Sumerian speakers and Semitic speakers, ancestors of the Akkadians and Babylonians. While Sumerian was the language of prestige and religious texts, Akkadian was spoken in many parts of the land. This bilingualism, and often multilingualism, characterized Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. Sargon of Akkad's empire, which unified Sumer and Akkad, simply formalized a reality that had existed for centuries. This interaction between different linguistic and ethnic groups fostered a rich cultural exchange, where ideas, myths, and technologies were shared and adapted, creating a dynamic and vibrant intellectual environment. The collapse of the Sumerian political entity around 2000 BC, with the fall of Ur to the Elamites, marked a turning point, but it was not an end. It was a transformation. The Sumerian language faded from daily speech, but it remained the classical language of religion, literature, and scholarship for another 2 millennia. Much like Latin in the European Middle Ages, Sumerian continued to be studied, copied, and revered by Babylonian and Assyrian scribes. Sumerian myths were retold, Sumerian gods were syncretized with Semitic deities, and Sumerian wisdom literature continued to instruct new generations. The sexagesimal system, the legal principles, the astronomical observations, and countless cultural practices continued to form the bedrock of successive Mesopotamian empires. In essence, the Sumerians were not lost in the sense of disappearing without a trace. They were the foundational layer, the deep roots from which subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations grew. Every time a Babylonian astrologer consulted the stars, every time an Assyrian king commissioned a new law code, every time a Mesopotamian merchant weighed out silver, they were, consciously or unconsciously, invoking the spirit of Sumer. The very fabric of Western civilization's intellectual and technological heritage is interwoven with threads spun in the dusty plains between the Tigris and Euphrates by a people who, with nothing but mud and ingenuity, dared to invent everything. They built the world's first cities, wrote its first stories, codified its first laws, and navigated its first existential crises, leaving an indelible mark on the human journey that continues to resonate today. Their story is a powerful reminder that true innovation is not confined to any single era, but is a continuous, often challenging act of creation that shapes the future in ways its originators could never have imagined.